Hello, me old China. Today we're taking a look at Unknown Armies, the second edition thereof. First edition was published in 1998. This second edition was published in 2002, and there was a third edition in 2017, but I missed out on that, and I am not paying over £200 on eBay for a game that I'll probably never get to play, and for which I have a perfectly effective edition. But there you go. People want a lot of money for it. Also, the third edition of Unknown Armies was split into 3 separate hardbacks and used a lot of photography in its illustration. So I'm kind of meh on spending a bunch of cash on that. I have played Unknown Armies a couple of times, and it was enjoyable. And the background to the game probably hasn't changed that much for the third edition, so yeah, I just can't justify buying it. So it is a modern, occult, conspiracy-ish game. I think the emphasis on the conspiracy seems to have been more in the supplementary materials and in the third edition. To me, the biggest influence on Unknown Armies would certainly seem to be the Invisibles, which was a comic series by Grant Morrison running from 1994 to 2000. At some point I'll probably review it because I own the big deluxe edition of it. Obviously, also, I think Mage was a bit of an influence, or at least was the zeitgeist kind of going around at the time. So, yeah, it's a modern occult game of the kind that was fashionable in the 90s, very much so. But it takes its cues far more from the subtler end of Clive Barker, Grant Morrison, obviously, and chaos magic and modern interpretations of magic with a K, much more than stuffy traditional magic. These days, more modern cultural touchstones would probably be things like Control, Alan Wake, China Mayville's less fantastical novels like King Rat and Kraken, perhaps. Also, I think things like SCP and analog horror probably ties in very nicely to Unknown Armies today. So those are probably the kind of things you want to think about if you're thinking of playing a game of Unknown Armies. Now, the game feels mostly aimed at street-level occult intrigue. If you've ever been part of a scene, you know the sort of petty struggles that go on in those scenes, and it kind of feels like that, dialed up to 11, with the additional issue of magic. Though it does have 2 other play modes. There's a global campaign, which is much higher level, and then a cosmic level campaign, which is higher again. A lot of this review is really going to be of the system, I think, because it's perhaps the most interesting part of the whole game. It's a quirky system. It is percentile. But this isn't Call of Cthulhu, put it that way. Your stats and your skills can both hypothetically be rated from 0 to 99. When you roll your D100, and it does sort of triple duty. There's the pass-fail consideration. You want to get as close as you can to your skill level when you roll. If you roll over both your stat and skill, that's a fail. If you roll under both your stat and skill, that's really good. If you roll just under your stat, that's less good. If you don't have a skill, you roll under your stat only if the games master allows you, and that permits a sort of minor success, not equal to what someone with the skill would have. If you roll a double, whether you passed or failed, that causes something more dramatic to happen. So it might have some extra effect, some drawback, some advantage or disadvantage. The more formalized versions of these are called cherries, which are normally associated with combat skills and magic more than anything else. I think you can see how Unknown Armies probably influenced some later narrative story games from the way in which all of this works. Your character is an obsessive magician. Yeah, some of this DNA that it shares with mage and with modern magical theory is this whole sort of will to power thing that you can, in a postmodern fashion, impose your will on the universe because everything is subjective. And if your subjective view is believed in strong enough, then you can warp reality. That's the kind of underlying metaphysic. But it's a lot more set and a lot less confusing for some people than mage might be. So one of your skills typically is based around your obsession, meaning that you can flip-flop the roll. So I rolled a 72, but because that skill's my obsession, I can swap that to a 27, which is then more likely to succeed, obviously. A 0-1 is a crit, 100 is a botch. Difficulties can be adjusted with shifts that either boost or detract from your underlying skill by between plus 30 and minus 30. There's also 3 grades of check. I said this would be a lot about the system, okay? Stop whining. There are minor, significant, and major grades of check. There are also minor, significant, and major other things throughout the game, like magical charges. Minor checks auto succeed if you have a skill of 15 or higher. Otherwise, you have to roll under your stat, minus 30. Significant checks, you'll have to roll equal to or under your stat and or skill. If you don't have the skill, you can get a weak success by rolling under your stat, minus 30. Major checks roll under your skill. If you don't have a skill, you roll under your stat, but only a crit or a matched pair actually succeeds. The standard skill levels are meant to be under duress, so intense situations or in combat. So in more normal investigative mode, you're likely going to have to hand out a lot of positive shifts to make the characters even remotely competent. And this does make difficulty calibration somewhat difficult, because what does under duress mean? It's not very well defined. So maybe you should take the skills plus 30 as being normal every day, and then apply bonuses or negatives to that. I don't know, but it makes it a bit difficult to calibrate those difficulties, something which keeps coming up recently for whatever reason. So characters become enmeshed in the occult underground through some sort of triggering experience that they have with weirdness or oddity or the occult, and after that you tend to become weirdness magnets and to get dragged into more occult, weird, peculiar happenings. So, that's a nice hook. It provides an excuse for why odd things might happen to your characters and bring them into things. Characters are primarily defined by their obsession, which can be used to, generally speaking, either make them into an avatar or an adept, which are the two forms of magic formalized in this universe. Avatars are embodiments of particular concepts, while adepts are magicians. An avatar needn't be like a classical Jungian archetype. It might be something more to do with pop culture or history, you know. But you get the idea. I mean, it could be something like the Diva, for example, or the Slaying Queen. You know, things like that. There's some examples in the books, but it's fairly open. Well, adepts channel magic through their obsessions and typically through some sort of transgressive action, by which they earn charges of magic, which can then be expended to create spells or effects. So those transgressions might be drugs, self-harm, weird inventions, obscure pornography, a massive book collection. You get the idea. Yeah, I'm surprised there's a third edition from 2017 as well, given the creative climate over the last 10 years. I wouldn't be surprised if the Epidiromancer, the one who cuts themselves, didn't make the cut in the third edition, but I don't know, because I don't have it, because it's too expensive. And then your character is defined by their passions, fear, rage, and nobility, each of which comes with some sort of trigger to set it off. To give you some idea of how powerful characters are, at the street level, you get 220 points to spend between 4 stats. Body, mind, soul, and something else. And then that only goes up by 20 points each for each of the higher levels. It's not a huge difference. Humans are reckoned typically to range between 30 and 70 in a statistic, and the average stat for a street level game would be 55-ish. You get skill points equal to the governing statistic to spend under that statistics category on skills that are under that statistic. Plus at street level you get 15 extra skill points. Plus you get a couple of other skills for free at level 15 here and there. Street level starting skills capped at 55, global at 70, cosmic at 85. Though through experience you can go higher later. The struggle skill in particular is worth noting. The game very much de-emphasizes combat. It gives you a whole bunch of options on how to de-escalate out of combat. But the struggle skill is the universal hand-to-hand fighting skill. No matter what style you might have, it's not going to matter whether you're into Krav Maga or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or whatever else. Everyone just kind of ends up on the floor biting each other, which is somewhat realistic, I guess. It does encourage you, both through the form of the game and through the rules, to avoid combat. Combat can be pretty goddamn deadly. Weapons typically have a max damage value and do what you roll as damage if we're talking about firearms. So if you roll and hit with a 42 on the roll with a gun that has a max damage of 50, then you're going to do 42 points of damage, and wounds and health is in the same sort of range as the stat. So, ow. In hand-to-hand, the damage is the sum of the roll, so that 42 with the gun would become 6 with a fist. And then melee weapons add a bonus to that, usually from +3 to +9, which seems a bit low for some weapons, to be honest, compared to the firearms. You know, knives are actually pretty deadly, but match successes can do more, and crits are usually an instant KO or a kill. So that roll of 42 would be 6, and then if you had a knife, that would take it up to 9 damage. There is a stress system, which is also really interesting. It's a bit like a sanity meter, but it has multiple tracks, and you can become hardened or more sensitive to certain things. So there are trigger levels, like, say, killing someone in a fight is trigger level 4. So, you know, that's a fairly heavy thing that can happen to you. Sensitivity levels are things like, say, level 2. You become very aware of violence and constantly paranoid and worrying and on the lookout for it. And then there are hardened levels, which under violence, say level 8 to 9 hardened, would make you callous, bitter, and you would barely react to even sickening violence or its aftermath. So there's violence, the unnatural, helplessness, isolation, and your sense of self, which are all of these things. It's a bit complex, possibly over-complex, but it's also very interesting as a more intriguing and detailed way of simultaneously tracking a measure of both sanity in the Call of Cthulhu type sense and humanity in a more vampire type sense. But what we're really here for is the magic, right? So you would think. This isn't mage, even though it shares a certain philosophical pedigree and premise with it. But magic in Unknown Armies is pretty rare and pretty weak source for the most part. Pretty much anyone can cast rituals. You just have to accumulate charges to do so and put them in. Charges are these little motes of magic you get, and they come in 3 flavors. Vanilla, strawberry, and chocolate, or minor, significant, and major if you prefer. You have to do something more significant and more major to get the higher level charges. You also have a limit on how many charges you can store, depending on your type of magic and what kind of investment you've put into it. A bibliomancer, for example, someone who casts magic from books and is obsessed with books, will need a shit ton of books in a library in order to store charges. They might also gain charges by buying a shitload of books, acquiring a rare book, or finding a unique book or a first edition of something. So their transgressions really are forbidden knowledge and a form of hoarding, effectively. But even so, with all these hoops to jump through, magic itself is, as I say, pretty weak. It doesn't do very much. It's not very reliable. It can be hard to perform, which seems weird for a game whose focus is primarily upon an occult underground of magicians. So, that's adepts. Avatars are even more limited, but slightly more powerful in that their minor powers are more reliable. They get an avatar skill related to what they embody, which fluctuates up and down depending on whether you violate taboos of that archetype or whether you fulfill and live out the ideals of that archetype. And that avatar skill can then be used to roll to reliably gain certain effects. So someone embodying the stereotype of the executioner, for example, will get advantages in combat against a particular assigned target. And those are the 2 main types, though you can play an ordinary person if you want. The world of the game is pretty loosely defined. Mostly it's different cabals and groups with different agendas and the occasional deity, demon, daemon, peculiar artifact, weird event or whatever showing up. So it mostly suits a very self-motivated group. And might well, as I said, be a good choice for running something a bit analog horror or internet horror. You could probably mine a lot of those things for ideas. So I have run evocative and spooky games of Unknown Armies, but they're games that I could have run in a lot of other things like Cult or Mage or innumerable other options. So what is special about Unknown Armies? Not a tremendous amount, to be honest. Playing the game does have a tendency to descend into the farcical adventures of comedically incompetent magicians repeatedly fucking up, unless they forget about the magic and don't bother with it, which is kind of ironic, considering it's a game about the occult and conspiracies. It turns out that just about anything else you might want to do during a game other than magic is generally both easier and more effective. Reminds me of that Mr. Gone quote from the Max. I am a student of the mystic and occult arts. Unfortunately, not a very talented student. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to keep shooting people with this gun. Or paraphrasing, anyway. You killed my hostage. It's a fun read, though, and it has some quirky, interesting ideas like fast food employees as an occult conspiracy. So it's fun as an object, and a kind of end cap on the 90s games, I guess, in terms of the second edition coming out in 2002. So, its support materials are fun to read, but the game can be quite challenging. And at least the second edition does have a bit of the embodiment of that infuriating 90s game design tendency to hide useful information and background in purple prose and the ramblings of unreliable narrators. I would say probably then, if you like Mage or Ars Magica, but you and your group have a hard time dealing with the kind of freeform magic that is the unique selling point of Mage, then Unknown Armies might be a good backup. And if you want something that's more kind of postmodern in approach, even more so than Mage, if you want something that is a more modern outlook on magic, then it's worth it on that basis. Now, I had my brief flirtations with magic ideas and practice, but I've ended up a 10th degree skeptomancer who doesn't believe any of it. But if you are a fan of the occult and want something that feels somewhat authentic and in which magic can hide with some reliability around reality, then this is probably also a good bet for you. It's an interesting stopping point in the development of narrative story games, anti-combat games, all of that kind of stuff. It's interesting. So, style, I give it a 4 for the presentation. It's full of interesting ideas, interesting system quirks and so on that embody the style, so that crosses over the line between style and substance. In terms of substance itself, though, 3. There's not a lot of particularly strong direction or hand-holding. It can be hard to know what to do with a game like this, which is why self-directing game groups they're a godsend in any system, but some games really rely on them, and this is one of them. So that's a 7 out of 10, a 3.5 out of 5. Brief reminder here that I use the full scale, so 7 out of 10 is pretty good. 3.5 out of 5, yes, it's above average. If you're interested in investigative, occult-oriented games, if you like Mage but your game group can't handle the freeform magic, Unknown Armies is probably a reasonable bet for you. And as a historical artifact, the end cap on the 90s, I find this edition in particular interesting. If you've had some experience with the third edition or own it, speak up in the comments. Let me know what's different, what you think about it, and the controversial use of photographs to illustrate the third edition. Zang. If you love my barely prepared content here, then you'll love my completely unprepared content on my streaming channel, which is youtube.com/grimstreams, which is pretty easy to remember.
The gallows is cold and the gibbet is lonely. We'll make things hard for you here. The gallows is cold and the gibbet is lonely. We'll make things hard for you, Joni, my dear.